In this episode, I am joined by the dynamic duo Matt and Doug as they discuss a listener's question all about converting other games to Mythras. Welcome to the Mythras Matters podcast, Season 1, Episode 52, Engaging Those Converting Skills. Hello and welcome to Mythras Matters, a podcast dedicated to the Mythras rule set and all its supplements. As always, I'm your host, Inwils, and welcome to December. I am always asking people if they have any topics that they would like us to discuss here on the podcast. And would you believe it? We got one! Yeah! Thank you to Krill Lowen. I possibly just murdered your username there, but if I did, apologies. And you are from the Tapper Talk forums, and you wanted to know about converting other rule sets and settings to Mythras. Well, I immediately thought about Doug and Matt and set up a meeting with them so they could share their knowledge and wisdom on the topic. So remember, if you would like to contribute to the podcast, then why not just drop me an email or message and let me know what you would like to cover or what you would like us to cover. I'm always looking for reviews or interviews with people or topics that you will find helpful. So if you're interested, you can email me at inwils@gmail.com or send me a message on the various forums I frequent. Okay, without further ado, let's get on with the chat. Time for the dynamic duo to introduce themselves once again.
I'm Doug Nordwall. I am Raleil on the Discord. I am the admin on there, and you can pretty much find me as Raleil anywhere. I'm a longtime Mythras fan and have did the Opposed Roles podcast for a while.
Yeah, brilliant. And we're also joined by Matt. Do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Matt Eager of Old Bones Publishing. Inwils has decided that I'm the rules guru. So
Yeah.
call me that too if you want to. And so, yeah, I actually don't do that much conversion for Mythras, but in the run up to this, I've been thinking about it. So I have a few nuggets to toss out there for you guys.
Brilliant. So there was go for it, Doug.
I was just going to say I think though that there's a part of conversion where you have to be pretty familiar with the rules to do a good job of it, right? Like you can't convert to a system that you don't know, and I think that's kind of a fundamental part of this.
Yeah. That's what I would call a necessary condition. Yeah, but it's not entirely sufficient. There are other things that can go wrong too.
For sure. Yes, I'm just going to start into this.
Just go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like on the Discord the other day, we had a person asking about converting some spells into classic fantasy. They were like, what do we do to convert Thunderwave? And I threw out a thing there where it was like, well, just go take Burning Hands and change it so it's not burning anymore and add in the bash effect, and that should get you really close. But I was thinking about it after the fact and realizing that person may not even realize that, one, the Burning Hands may be there and may look exactly like it. Two, that the bash exists and that it actually exists in, like, there's bash and then there's knockback, and those things are different. And three, that Thunderwave did not exist until like late second edition, third edition. I think there was a Thunderwave spell somewhere buried in the Forgotten Realms, but like it's a relatively new spell. It's not like a super classic spell that everybody knows. And it really didn't get real airtime until fourth edition, I think, when it became a tactical game and it was important. And so like if they don't have that knowledge behind that, that makes it kind of hard to kind of realize the context that you're shooting for, right? So anyways, because of that and some other things we had seen, we decided that we were going to talk about conversion on the like we've got a whole bunch of really interesting Mythras conversions out there, like the Dark Sun one that's on the Discord. There's an Al-Qadim one that's out there. I think there's a Warhammer one. There's a whole pile of them out there that people go through and put together from other game systems just because they prefer Mythras more.
Yeah. Dark Sun is an excellent campaign setting. I love Dark Sun completely. So I've never converted at all. So I'm really interested, the starting point. Where would you both suggest that we start if somebody's wanting to convert from one to the other? What would be a really good starting point for them?
So I think that there are two key aspects, one of which Doug has already brought up, and that is you really have to understand the differences between the old rule set and the new ones, which means basically you have to know both sufficiently well. And that's going to be the key to avoiding obvious pitfalls. Like we were talking a little bit in advance. If you just take your classic old D&D adventure and you're like, level 1 of your dungeon crawl features a room full of kobolds, right? If there are, 8 kobolds in that room and you have 4 people in the party, you're probably going to get hammered.
Yeah.
And that's because of the difference between the way, OSR type rules handle what we call the action point economy in Mythras. It's a very different thing. If you get outnumbered in Mythras, you're toast.
It's a very serious difference.
Right. So that it's, if you don't understand that Mythras works fundamentally differently in that aspect of combat than, OSR type D&D, you're going to have an unpleasant surprise when you convert that material over. So that's one example. You have to know the rule sets in order to know the differences between them in the key areas to avoid, mechanical pitfalls like that. The other thing that I would say is you really have to understand the intent behind the original material.
That's a huge thing.
Yeah, I had something written down here to remind me. Oh, okay. And you have to kind of be able to, and this comes down to how well the original material is written, how easy it is to understand at some level. But you have to do the work. You have to do your own part, assuming the author did a good job, right? But you ought to be able to understand from the original setting, what the limits are essentially. Like in the original Star Wars movie, right? A New Hope, what we call in our generation just plain Star Wars,
yes.
Right. The first one, right? So your big bad is clearly going to be Darth Vader in that setting, right? Nobody is tougher or cooler than Darth Vader. Darth Vader walks into the room and the clock stopped ticking, right? That is the point of Darth Vader in there.
Yeah.
In that first movie. And that is what I would call a truth, capital T, about that setting. So you ought to be able to think about also like A Fistful of Dollars, right? Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name character.
Yeah.
Nobody's better with a gun than that guy, right? Yeah. He's the best. So there are these kinds of framing elements that go in all these cases.
I'm gonna throw something in there that kind of ties into that. So along with the frame, I find that it is important uh to find the baselines within the game, right? Like either an average or a minimum or a maximum, right? Like
Right.
these are the goal, these are things that you can kind of play with to understand, am I in the right ballpark of that? You're very rarely going to get it exact. It almost never happens. But understanding that, a dagger is worth one gold piece, or if that's a basis for the monetary system, right? Like you can kind of govern that stuff. If you
Right.
understand that your stat range is 3 to 18, well, you probably map it to Mythras just fine. But if your stat range is, say, 1 to 6, like Shadowrun is, for normal humans, then okay, I got to multiply it by 3 and it'll kind of map close. Or if it's 1 to 10, like say Cyberpunk is, that might be a little different altogether. But kind of going through, kind of understanding the system enough, say these are the baselines that we have to work with. And another thing that you mentioned there with the framing, that I want a specific example that I want to touch on, that Rod Leary mentioned when he was doing classic fantasy, was that the attack roll in Dungeons and Dragons is not an attack roll. It's not really an attack roll at all. It's a damage roll. It's like a chance to do damage roll. And so that's why, I
Yeah.
mean, they don't have opposed rolls, so they can't factor in defense. And
Right.
so when you
Your
start,
armor class is your defense. Yeah.
right, your armor class is your defense, right? So the attack roll means something different in D&D than it does in Mythras. And so you have to kind of weigh these things together. Like so when you're rolling to attack in D&D, you have to factor in your chance to do that damage is in there. And so mapping that over to Mythras is a lot harder than it really looks like, right? That's there's some tricks that go along with that.
Right. Doug has gone back to the mechanical stuff, which is fine. I don't mind at all. I think that because it can be so difficult to find a formulaic model for translating mechanics from one system to the other, like that you could put into a computer and get out
Yeah,
a
yeah,
nice
yeah.
rewritten. That is extremely difficult in general. It's not impossible. It may not even be,
In some cases,
especially
it works, but in some cases, no way. It's definitely an art, right?
right. And that's the point that I would like to emphasize. If you understand the original material and you understand, the big truths that frame it and everything, that's what's going to help you create what I would call a faithful translation. A faithful conversion
Yeah.
means you're preserving the truths of the original, even if the mechanics get a little bit weird
You're
at some
preserving
point.
the feel of it, right? Like ultimately you're preserving the feel. And I think
Yeah.
that's what a lot of conversions, like you want to get that feel out of it, because then the mechanics will start to fade into the background at that point because people are enjoying the feel of that thing.
Right.
The I told my folks when we were doing our we had a classic fantasy game that was based on the Red Hand of Doom, which is an old 3E module, and essentially you kind of start in media res and in a battle, and you realize that there's an army that's assaulting a town, going to take over a section of the world, and there are villages that are going to be destroyed, and there's a slow march towards the end final battles in a city, right? And I told them, I said, look, I wanted to make sure that this had a particular feel with it. And so I straight up told them at the beginning, you should be looking at this like Dragonlance. Like this should feel just like Dragonlance. There should be a lot of passions that are going here. It's kind of the same thing where there's an army on the move coming through, and you should be running from place to place. And even just that level of framing that conversation, framing the game with them, really helped the whole business. It helped them kind of say, all right, I want to do this thing. This is the mechanic that I would think that would go there. And oftentimes you can say, yeah, that's exactly what you would do. That's it. That's exactly how that goes.
Presuming your players know the rules well too. Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, but although honestly, with Mythras, if you can 80 or 90% of the stuff is, hey, which skill do I roll, right? Like, or is this a hard penalty, right? Like it's a percentile dice. That part is relatively simple.
Right. Yeah, that is really, I think, the best way to run any game, whether it's a conversion or not, is players say, I want my guy to do thus and such. What does that mean? And the GM says, oh, that means you roll your stealth at hard or whatever. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about was the depth that Mythras has with the combat. You know, it's a very in-depth, as in I really like it, not necessarily complex, but this idea that it is totally different from other games that I've played, especially with the specials, and they can really change combat dramatically, you know, in a single sword swing, you know, that all of a sudden press advantage is going up. And I was wondering how we would cope with that idea of this combat having such a rich depth to it in Mythras, and whether or not it will become overpowered if we don't treat it right in the conversion process.
Yeah, so I think I'm thinking about how I go about doing this. I honestly, funny as it sounds, because it is so rich and in depth, I actually dial down the combats. Like there are less of them.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like it by any means, but it's like eating cheesecake, right? You can only eat so much of it sitting at the table, right? Like it's very.
It would be a terrible mistake.
Right. It's very rich, and you'd get sick off of it. So ultimately, I tend to dial them back, and they tend to feel a little bit more set piece. And if I do want to have some tacit opposition in there, it will be maybe a few less people, or I'll use the rabble rules or something like that to kind of say, no, really, look, this is background. This is, you know, this shouldn't last that long. In the extreme example, a person could just say, look, we're going to do a task round on this combat. And the, you know, the price of that, a price of each failure is, you know, you take a minor wound or something like that. Right.
Right.
So you know, that's kind of an extreme example, but it totally works, right? Like it would be perfectly fine for conveying that.
One of the I think one way to say it is, you know, every time you introduce randomness into the game, you know, which basically means dice rolling. There's a chance for stuff to go off the rails. And there's no time when you do more dice rolling than in combat. So yeah, every time you stage a combat, especially in Mythras, there's a chance for unanticipated things to happen, right? So yeah, it's important to have a feel for what the writer had in mind in the first place. Like, is this supposed to be a minor encounter? You know, maybe I should use the rabble rules in that case, because the chances that rabble are going to be able to dust the characters are pretty low. You know,
right. Well, I mean, this brings us back to your kobolds, right? Like the you know, you've got 8 kobolds there. Making them up as fully fleshed out characters, even if they're small guys, may not be what you want, because they're a fair bit tougher than you know, even if they've got like, you know, 50% skill, they're like a fair bit tougher than you would do in D&D, right? So making them rabble would be a good choice as well. Like that. I had something more to say there, but you know, I mean, we get back sort of to the framing of it, and how you can use these combats more as scenery or painting, or, you know, this is a minor conflict on the way to something else, and it should not take more than 15, 20, 30 minutes at the table, and you're good to go, right? Like that's it tells part of the story. It's not the story itself.
Right. That's good.
One of the other things that I was thinking about is the difference in the health of two systems, because Mythras has a really good hit location that doesn't level. You know, what you start off with is what you're going to get. And I was wondering, how is the best way round to convert those higher level monsters or opponents that might be doing like, you know, huge amounts of damage, and how does that relate to combat in the Mythras system?
Right. Example. Party of three, fairly powerful characters, what, 8th level, 10th level characters, comes across a T-Rex in D&D. T-Rex is fairly tough, but it's not going to stand a chance against those three.
No, it's not.
characters.
It's not. I mean, there's examples of that in recent adventures, right? Like the Tomb of Annihilation has T-Rex all over it, right? But a T-Rex in Mythras is a very different proposition, right? Like it's like, oh, well, you're gone, right? Like
Nice knowing you, friends.
Yeah.
You can't outrun it.
He
You
just
can't
did it.
defend against it.
You blocked that with your shield, and you lost your torso, right? It was right. First off, I never take whatever is written in the book and try to map that directly, right? Like it's not. I never take like, oh, this guy does 10d8 worth of damage. I never take that. Never. That never happens. I go back and look at sort of the base attributes and rebuild. So if we're looking at the T-Rex and say, okay, a T-Rex is X amount of size. What is that in Mythras? Oh, look at that. He's pretty tough. And then I think from that stems a different sort of baseline that you do. So like if you're looking at your 8th level, 10th level characters in Mythras, and they don't have any cults to go along with that, they're screwed, right? Like or they better be having some good equipment to go along with it, right? Like ballistas and a lot of tactics, right? Like they have to really think a lot differently at that point to deal with that. But for the actual conversion itself, I honestly just look at, okay, this is intended to be a cat-sized thing that and then I build up the stats for a cat-sized thing.
Got you.
I don't try to map it super close. Size is the biggest one on that. It is like by far the biggest one. Almost everybody else has a strength. They have an agility of some, dexterity of some variety. They have a willpower, or power, or charismas, right? But size, a lot of systems don't have size.
Yeah.
And it doesn't factor into the thing. But size is the big bugbear. And I say, just let it ride. Like. It'll teach you, for one thing, exactly how powerful the characters are in other games when they're going and dealing with this stuff, right? Like your 8th and 10th level fighters and whatnot are fighting T-Rex. Like they can solo a T-Rex, right? Like they could theoretically do that pretty well. Like how tough is that guy?
Yeah, I think that brings up a key difference between D&D, for example, and Mythras, is that size, as Doug points out, is what gets you more hit points, essentially. Size of con. Human scale characters can only have so many hit points, never mind so many hit points per location, which is even less. And the concept of being able to one-shot something, right? If you have a character with 80 or 100 hit points, even the toughest monsters probably can't one-shot you in D&D, unless you're using optional rules for massive damage or something, which may be in some editions of the game. But they had to bolt on a whole optional system to handle that in that game, as opposed to Mythras, where it's just baked in, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that.
I think one thing I do want to talk about here with regards to that, and specifically hit points, is that I tend to go through when I'm doing the conversion. I say, okay, if we have a monster that has some baseline in the system, and we can pick on D&D all day, but it's by far the most known, and they're also the most known for having metrics for combat.
Right.
And right, like
Challenge
there's
ratings
a
and stuff.
challenge rating or hit dice or what. These are metrics for it, which is useful. I go and say, okay, if I have this where this monster is a fair fight for a single character, if I can do it for a single character, I'll take it because it removes the variables out of the equation. But if it's for a party, then I'll say, okay, how long is it going to take them to remove all the hit points from this character? And
Because
then I
that's what
say,
combat is in that game. Yeah.
right. That's exactly where it is in that game. How long is that going to take? And then I say, okay, then he should have skills about at this range because an approximately equivalent Mythras character would be this. And you can do the math on this. For those of you who are super nerdy, you can go to any dice and figure it out. If you don't, come and ask us, we'll figure it out, right? Like it's not that hard. But I kind of try to get that feel. It's never precise. It never is, and sometimes I'm lazier than others. Other thing I wanna bring up in here, my own personal thing, and Matt will go for feel, and I'll go for mechanics as much as anything. We'll take those sides, but I think they're both important. Back to the notion of the T-Rex versus the 8 kobolds. The big thing that you actually want to see there is not actually the hit points, it's the action points that are coming out of that. So like the T-Rex has probably got 3. He might have 2. And the kobolds probably have 16. And that's not an exaggeration. They may have 24 if they have a reasonable dex, right? So Trick, my Mythras challenge rating, if you take each character of the PCs, the player characters, and multiply their skill and their primary combat ability, whether it's spells or otherwise, it doesn't matter, by their action points, and then add up all those numbers, and then do the same thing for the other side. If they are approximately equivalent within 10% of each other, that's a really fair fight. That'll be a good, tough fight. That's it. Now that's super inaccurate. Please, gosh, it is. There are lots of factors to get into that. Like if you have a party that looks like they're going to beat up a T-Rex, but they only have daggers, then that's going to be a problem, right? Like, but
you could start layering on other things.
It's a
average damage for armor points.
Yeah. How much do crits factor in? Range,
potential to one shot. Yeah. Like the T-Rex has, right?
Yeah.
Because then all of a sudden the whole equation changes because the sum on one side got diminished by one character's worth of contribution,
right?
Because they got one shot.
Right.
So the next round turns out to be very different suddenly.
But I very rarely had that go wrong on non-set piece, non-singular thing arguments. So like, orcs versus humans or something like that works really well. Works really well.
That sounds really a great idea to sort of like keep that balance. And I really like the way that we keep going back to that feel and, what is that encounter meant to be like? Whether or not is it the end encounter, is it just a minor imposition as we're going through? But what about magic? Because magic is hugely different. I mean, we were talking about Shadowrun as well, and Shadowrun and D&D are completely different, and D&D and Mythras is completely different. So just without talking about specific spells, we might get onto that, but just this idea of magic is powered in Mythras via power points, which is different from some other games. How would we approach magic?
So I mean, at some point they are actually they're both powered, but they're powered. I think they're both powered over time, right? Like time
Yeah,
time is a thing that you can really latch onto in most games as a baseline conversion point, right? Like so D&D has spells per day. Mythras has mana points that you can use per day.
right.
Shadowrun has a healing rate that's associated with the character based on how much stun damage they take, right? Like, and they can cast spells all day as long as they can, recover it. But there's kind of at some point you get a range in there that they get stuck on.
I was going to say this is an interesting point. There's so magic points in Mythras determine how many times you can cast your spells, right? There's actually a limit to how many times you can attack with your sword in Mythras too, although we usually don't think about
Yeah.
it. It's determined by the accumulation of fatigue, which is a rather different set of rules. But I mean, most fights in Mythras don't last long enough for fatigue to become a super big deal. But yeah, you could just run out of gas and not be able to attack effectively anymore. So I think being able to count magic points, like, oh, if he's going to use, rack or lightning bolt or whatever, and it's going to cost him 3 magic points every time he does it, well, then that means he can cast it 5 times. That's a very straightforward calculation compared to sorting out how long his fatigue will hold swinging a sword. So in that sense, I think reckoning magic might be a little easier than reckoning plain combat.
Absolutely. At least as far as resource consumption goes,
Right.
figuring out power of things. Going with the classic attack spells. Fireballs or acid bolts or whatever comes out of it. That gets a lot trickier because now you're crossing into that hit point pool versus hit location thing. You're crossing into armor as damage reduction versus armor as reducing hit chance.
Right.
That gets a lot more complex. And frankly, I still do this. I still go and say, okay, this is a damaging spell and it hits multiple people. I'll go over to Mythras and say, okay, where's my damaging spell that hits multiple people? Do I want it to hit individual targets, or do I want it to be invent a new shaping component for area or something like that, right? Thank you, Leoness, for putting in area as a shaping component. Finally,
Yes,
right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, what about, because obviously in Mythras we have sorcerer magic and we have the theists, which sort of like separates up to the clerics and the mages or the illusionists, etc. What about the mystics and I was just thinking my favorite magic system at the moment, just because we have somebody playing one, I've really got into animists, and spirits. And I think they add a real depth to the game. And I sort of like wonder whether or not do we just ignore them, or do we sort of like try to incorporate to keep that feel of Mythras going?
So go ahead, Matt. Go ahead. I have long and storied opinions on this. So
it is possible that you may pick a rule system that is just really not especially compatible with the original material. So suppose you're taking we'll just use it, a D&D adventure or a Savage Worlds adventure or something, and you're going to translate that to Mythras. And you know that on the Mythras side of it, you want there to be mystics and animists, right? There may not be really good equivalents to that in the original source material. So you may be able to, on the back end, add that in, even though it wasn't present in the original source material. However, if you were trying to go in the opposite direction, starting from Mythras with its mystics and animists and translate it to D&D or something, that might be a heavier lift, I think.
Yeah,
trying to find a clean conversion there.
Yeah,
there might really be incompatibilities.
So at one point I noodled the idea of converting Monster Island to 5th edition. And I was kind of going through it and I was like, sort of mentally categorizing out stuff. And I got to animism and realized there has not been a system to do anything like that in a long time in D&D. There has been
Really?
the Shire and back in second edition Al-Qadim, very close. Like you're gonna pull something in and it's actually gonna do a spell effect. It's like Call a Buddy, right? Like it's exactly what it is. But it hasn't been around for a long time because they abstract everything out to so much to you get this mechanical effect that comes out of it. And I suppose you could just say, they get these buffs that come that are there. Doing it the other way, going from like say a fifth edition or a Shadowrun, and I'm going to pick on Shadowrun here because they actually have a clear summoning conjuring system. I think that it adds a lot more to the game, even if you are adding some mechanical heft and frankly, you're going to have to develop some new stuff. So like in Shadowrun, there are like spirits of man and spirits of the air and spirits of water and fire and all that. But ultimately, all of those spirits, like all of them, with a couple of very small exceptions, they're nature spirits. That's it. They have about 3 abilities. They like have their whatever the area containment one, demean, yeah. And like a couple of, that's it. There's nothing else. Like that's the scope of their use. And I'm like, oh well, that seems kind of boring, to be honest. There's no guardian spirits, no healing spirits. One could take like the radiation spirits and call them Bane or Wraiths or something like that. Or
insect spirits and things like that.
Yeah. But they're very limited set of abilities. And so I was like, wow, I'd like to bring them in and do something more with them and really sort of look at shamans like, now you're a lot more than just like, rattle shaking mages, right?
Yes.
That's kind of what they are in Shadowrun. The differences are relatively minor. Even if you move it down to like, well, I can only summon nature spirits or I can only summon elementals. Those spirits are really boring, right? Like the elementals are like, I summon a guy and he can go beat on stuff, right? And it's a pretty limited set of abilities compared to what you get. So I honestly, I think that going the other way probably makes your world a lot richer.
This is the kind of stuff that ties the narrative to the mechanics. If you were just looking at these things as a way to get a mechanical effect, that's a little bit different, than something else. If you like to talk about it in terms of class protection or something like that, right? Yeah. There has to be a meaningful difference, and I'm going to just like mess around with it until I create a meaningful difference because I need a meaningful difference to justify the existence. Yeah. That's different from starting from a narrative thing where, shamans are powerful and they are your door to the spirit world. I mean, that is a setting feature. That's a truth.
Yes, that's a truth. Yes.
And that's what makes it cool.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, that touches back on the conversation that we had a couple of months ago about restrictions, right? Like shamans are the door to the spirit world, says nobody else is, right? Like you don't get access to that. And they have their own set of restrictions. And that really shapes that world a lot.
Hugely. And there's so much that brings to a campaign, as I'm finding, that animists are just fantastic. We both of you touched on it. There is that apart from Shadowrun, I've never had a fantasy setting with the animist in it. It's something completely new. I've got 2 more questions.
Somebody should probably send us a note to say, hey, these settings have real spirits that you can use that has a fully developed sort of thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. So 2 more things that I was thinking about. One of the things was magical items, not only magical weapons, but also magical items that might actually impact the balance of the game and how how do we cope with that conversion? I mean, my Mythras campaign does not have magical items. There's no magical items there, but I can see that some players would like magical items, and there might be magical items in modules or other campaign material. So how do we cope with that?
Let me give you a couple examples.
Yeah.
Truth about the setting of Elric.
Yes.
Stormbringer
yes.
is the ultimate. And there's a twin Mournblade, right? But okay, fine. Stormbringer is the ultimate. Whoever can wield Stormbringer is basically going to be undefeatable. Jedi weapons in Star Wars. If you have a lightsaber, that is something special. They're not unique, certainly, but they are extremely special. Arthurian myth, Excalibur, for example, right? Or in the more recent Jason Momoa Conan movie, they're trying to remake the Mask of Acheron to unleash hell on earth. In that case, that magic item was a MacGuffin. So it was less interesting in terms of, it was key to the campaign and the setting there, but it was not meant to be used routinely by a player character. It was just something that drove the plot, right? And that you're in the boss fight when they finally get the last piece, right? Magic items in old school D&D, magic items were just, another form of currency, essentially. Everybody had magic items and tons of them. And I was reminded about how ridiculous it was watching the Dungeons and Dragons movie when I was on a plane about a month ago.
Yeah.
It's just like, Jesus,
Yeah.
who is minting all these gold coins? Who is slavishly creating all these magic?
You need to have a magic mint. That's what you do. That's how you mint the gold coins, obviously.
I guess. So I was just sitting around looking at this Monty Hall aspect, which reminded me with wry amusement of my youth. I don't run games like that anymore. I don't enjoy it anymore. Magic items have this, I guess if you've been a player for a long time in RPGs, it's kind of like, in your blood at some level. If you started off with the old games, you may have this idea that magic items are an inescapable part of the game. I think it's much more interesting when they are rare, if not singular, unique, and they don't have to be MacGuffins. That's one of the things that bugs me about an OSR system is it's really hard to suddenly make a magic item that, is a MacGuffin, because you'll have some jackass in the group say like, oh, why don't I just take my portable hole and we'll stick it in there and then throw it away or something. I mean,
exactly.
Oh yeah.
There's so many ways to derail the master plot.
So when I guess a couple of things that I wanna pull on that thread. One, so many magic items in the games are actually there to cover up mechanical deficits, right? Like that, like if you can actually play 5th edition without magic items. There's rules for it, right? Like there's straight up published rules. They're in the DMG where you get static bonuses, right? There's static bonuses. And if you go and take a look at that, that'll match Mythras a lot closer. And not because like we don't have magic items in Mythras by any means. It's because that those static bonuses represent skill increases, right? Like they map exactly, right?
Right.
Or at least multiply by 5, and this should be good to go, right?
Yeah.
So if you kind of take a look at it like that and say, okay, if I'm going to get rid of all of those static increases, then what sort of things are left? A list of things that probably actually look really good as gifts. They're new abilities. They're forking out from whatever the character path is, right? Like if you have a cloak that allows you to turn invisible, that's functionally a gift. And maybe you end up in a situation where you're giving out gifts to the players, to the player characters, rather than giving them a magic item. And that makes them special and also avoids the portable hole issue, right? Like Yeah, maybe you don't give out a portable hole.
Or bag of holding.
Right, or bag of holding, right? Like you're right. Like
I,
so
go for it.
there's like yeah, I think that, kind of look at it closely and say, what is this really accomplishing? If I can accomplish this some other way, then it might be a better way to do it there.
I,
Of course, classic fantasy has lots of +1 weapons and whatnot. And those are
exactly.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can always just go pull those, right? Like those ones are easy. They just add +1 to damage.
Yeah. And
And we don't do a lot of damage escalation in D&D, or in Mythras. Not a lot. There's a little bit here and there, but
that is very true. There's very little damage escalation. And I mean, my favorite classes have to be like the magic users, and a lot of the time I feel that mages have like a wand of magic missile or staff of the magi that actually allows them to not draw on their own spells,
yep.
but allow them to still be a mage in like all situations, and I just feel that sometimes if those were taken away, how would that villain or that character actually, what would be the alternative in Mythras for that? Is there an alternative or not?
Well, there's several that you could go with, right? Like there's a bunch of different ways depending on which magic system you want to go with. Like, so you could have a wand that has magic points in it. That's like the straight up, like this is an extra battery. Great.
I would just call them charges.
Right. You could call them charges. And
you can use this 3 times a day, or you can use this 20 times a day. Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, you can do that. I think some of the more interesting stuff is when you start pulling in the Mythras magic systems. Like so imagine for a moment that you had a wand of targets, and it gave you 3 shaping points that allows you to apply to targets in your spells. Simple as that. And now you can do it to multiple things, and you could even do it to a whole bunch. And maybe you have 7 shaping points and you drop 7 into range, and now you can do it to 3 targets, or you can kind of manipulate that around a bit, right? That gives you a lot of flexibility. I think it's more interesting than wand of magic missiles, right? And that the other thing is it doesn't actually give them any new spells, right? Like they don't have to have a new spell there. They can just use their old spell. Which is the other thing that I find in other games. It's like, I have a wand of magic missiles, but why would I use that? I have 6 lightning bolts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, very true.
In one of my adventures, I included a magic item that was meant to be powerful and unique. And in Savage Swords Against the Necromancer, I gave the villain the amulet of Gish, which was like this, just as a piece of jewelry, it was fantastically valuable. It has like the largest sapphire in the world or whatever, right? Yeah. Magically speaking, it means that as long as this guy has the amulet around his neck, he has as many magic points as the GM wants to give him, right? I didn't even specify a number, just as much as you want. And so that is the kind of item that I might introduce into a game if it was going to be rare. It has like a special ability that in other games might not seem especially magical or whatever, but like this sword is unbreakable, something like that, or this can cut anything, right? That kind of thing. Or these boots give you +3 grades to stealth or something like that. Like I think Doug mentioned something like that would be the kind of thing I would tend to introduce. That villain in the adventure doesn't need to have the amulet, strictly speaking. And maybe the players, because they don't know any magic, can't actually even use the amulet as it's meant to be. But there might be other indirect effects that the game master could use if anyone survived that adventure. Yeah. Maybe use that amulet in a subsequent adventure in the campaign. It might come back to help or haunt somebody in a different way. So there's always that. you have to understand again what the author had in mind. If they meant this to just be a +1 sword or whatever, you're going to treat that very differently than this is meant to be the amulet of Gish, and it's the only one like it in the world. That kind of stuff.
Brilliant. So I'm just checking the time, and we're coming close to the end of our allotted time. So I wonder whether or not both of you can sum up your main key point about conversion. What would be the one thing that you would say, this is the unbreakable rule to use? Who would like to go first?
Okay, so unbreakable rule. I don't think any of the rules are unbreakable, but I think the one bit of very serious advice, having done this a number of times, is that take it small, take it slow. Don't overcommit yourself into stuff, because it's very easy to get yourself caught up in it. I need this to be exactly like this other system, when in fact you don't actually need that at all. That you can get it pretty close, and it'll be perfectly fine for your table, and you'll get to preserve more of the Mythras stuff that you like.
Right. And I would say reserve the right to, if you make a mistake and you accidentally break something and you only discover it because of an edge case that comes up in your actual game, which, by the way, is all that really matters when you're playing through this. How many times are you going to play through it? Probably not more than once. So if your actual use case gets broken, you as GM should say, oh, I thought I should handle it using this rules or whatever, but we need to walk that back and do it this way. And your players need to be prepared for that. I guess I would say, from my point of view, you ought to, in addition to understanding the rules of both systems, to try to avoid unintended consequences, right? Know the differences so that you don't do things that are awkward by accident. You understand the truths that the creator of the original material had in mind, and let those shape the way you use the rules in the new system to express those same truths. If it means that Darth Vader has a willpower of 100 and a combat style of 120, then that needs to be true. If it means something different, then do that.
Thank you to both of you for coming along and sharing your words of wisdom. As always, I've learned so much, and I really like both the approaches, I think it's really about this feel, isn't it? That's the thing that we want to maintain, and having that knowledge is so important of both the original system and the system that we're converting to. So thank you so much for giving up your time. It's been fantastic talking to you both. Okay, before you stop listening, I have to say that what you've actually heard was the second ending to the interview. If you stay tuned until after the Creative Commons license announcement at the end of this episode, we have provided you in true blooper style the original ending. So please keep listening. And that's it. Another episode of Mythras Matters completed. Don't forget you can check out all my content by following my YouTube channel and the campaign areas on World Anvil. I really appreciate your support, and do check out both the Discord and the Tapper Talk forums, where there are great people sharing ideas within the discussions. So until next time, have a fantastic Christmas and celebrate the new year as much as you would like. And also have a great month of gaming, and I will chat to you all again in January. Until then, I hope all your opposed rolls succeed and provide you with a well-deserved special. Thanks for listening, everyone. See ya. Bye. The content of this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license, so please give appropriate credit if you are sharing or copying any part of this podcast. Thank you. You can say thank you if you want. No.
Thought you were going to press
You
stop.
should make sure. You should make sure to include this part.
I am going to. I'm definitely going to include this part in it.
Thank God we're done. I thought Doug was never going to stop talking about it.
I hear that at least once a week.
I am definitely stopping it now.